Hey IT friends and trunk slammers, you're all welcome here. Today I want to talk a little bit about a really interesting concept. Onsites. The on-site visit. Going to the client in person to do a thing, whatever that thing is. I want to break down a little bit of kind of why I think that generally that's something you want to try to avoid as a service provider, but maybe not for the reasons you're thinking. Because I bet most of the reasons you're thinking that on-sites are useful, you're probably right. Just not as useful as long-term as you've convinced yourself they are. Now, some of my viewers that know a little bit about me are going to say, hey, wait a minute, you're biased. You work for multiple vendors that specifically offer products that are really only remote products. And, well, you're right. I am biased against on-sites, but it's not because of that. It's because I was a service and operations manager at an MSP that eventually grew very large, and I saw how much revenue, margin, time, frustration, and actual lack of client satisfaction on-sites would chew into, and how little value they often actually brought unless they were used as a strategic tool. And all too often what I observe is that MSPs fall really into one of two broad categories, or both, with on-sites. They either try to have recurring scheduled on-sites on way too frequent of a basis for really any priced client. We'll get into that. Or they tend to use on-sites reactively, which makes sense, to solve kind of any problem, especially any problem that the client is expressed a frustration, non-positive vibes about. Let's just send someone there. They'll get to see it, and seeing it means it's better. And I think that superficially, the reason why this happens is most of the reasons service providers give for wanting to go on site, fundamentally, those ingredients, those reasons are correct. The challenge is separating the causation and correlation. That's where it gets a little tricky with on-sites, where you start going on-site, spending a lot of time on-site for a very, very low return. So let's go over a little bit of that. Why, some things to look out for, and how I would consider approaching on-sites. A cool thing about this subject, it doesn't matter your revenue model, whether you are recurring, whether you are completely break fix, whether you have a retainer, whether you charge for some things and not for others. For the purpose of this video, it actually doesn't matter how you're collecting revenue in regards to these on-sites affecting billing. But all of the reasons why this doesn't really help the long-term relationship the way most of us kind of convince ourselves it does applies to any revenue model. And there's not a lot of things that I can talk about operationally I can say that for. So it's kind of cool to be able to say that it doesn't matter how you collect money from your clients. On sites with too high a frequency that are uncontrolled and used as sort of a stopgap for everything really is not a smart move for any service provider. And before you tune out of this video early, think about any service provider, not even MSPs, literally any service on earth, unless that service has to be rendered only in person, which there really aren't that many of them. They don't want to go on site. Think about that. Think about any service you concern that can go on site, the hoops they go through to prevent sending somebody on site. And I'll give you a spoiler. It's not because they're bad at customer service and they hate their clients and they're cheap. It's because it's actually a really terrible business model to scale a services business. And for those of you that heard that and they're like, yeah, but it's good customer service, Dean, and we're a customer service organization, and you're about to tune out of the video. Well, hold on for a second here. It is. Except it stops being that after a while. And to give an example of that, think of all those services someone does have to come on site to do. And my favorite example of that would be something like lawn care, groundskeeping. Eventually, as those folks come on site with more and more frequency, they become invisible. I don't mean that you're a terrible person and you're like, oh, that's the help, I don't acknowledge them. I don't mean that kind of invisible. I mean, it becomes such an expected part of the routine that any value derived from seeing them do the work on site even if that's quite literally what you're paying for, evaporates very quickly. After only a few visits, they blend in, they become a fixture. They're just part of the day-to-day. And I say that because if any of you think that going on site frequently is customer service, it is occasionally. Absolutely. You were 100% correct. You start repeating it, it isn't. You lose all that value. It just poof, goes away. And you are just the help. You are part of the background. Doesn't mean people won't acknowledge you, smile, say hi to you, or any of that. But the net impact on the relationship and the ability to prevent churn evaporates after a very short amount of time of doing that. And it just becomes a normal thing you do that actually will damage the relationship if you have to stop doing it. Because my lawn care guys have been coming for a year and I kind of just expect it and don't even pay attention to it. The day they don't come, they were supposed to, sure noticed that. So there's a trap you can fall into there. Let's talk a little bit about some of the revenue implications and just in general why both types of on-sites can really be a lot more risky at any size service provider than you might realize. There are, of course, reactive tickets or proactive tickets that are occasionally going to require hands-on, eyes-on by one of your employees. And I think any service provider at any level rendering any quality of service, that is going to happen occasionally. So my goal here is not to convince you that you should never, ever, ever roll a truck. You do want to be very intentional, very discreet, and very sparing with how you use those opportunities. So, of course, installing a new piece of equipment makes a lot of sense to potentially go on site. If a critical piece of equipment is failing and all remote options have been exhausted, probably send someone on site. Move ad changes, probably send someone on site. An important VIP that is frustrated with your remote experience and has exhausted all reasonable remote measures, I could see why you'd send someone on site. So I just want to be clear. I'm not saying don't send someone on site. Very, very high value, high client experience touch point we want to use very sparingly, like a very special high value treat that we only give out when it is either incredibly important for us or it's going to be incredibly impactful for the client. And in both cases, we have to understand that the client may not see any value in us going on site, and there is a risk we have to take there that the cost we're throwing into it, we are potentially throwing away that day and writing it off. That has to be your mindset with reactive and proactive on-site. So the most basic reason why I feel as a service provider, you really kind of want to have somewhat of an anti-on-site mentality as an overall solution for things, is quite simply at your highest opportunity cost engagement you can possibly provide as a service provider. If you don't know what opportunity cost means, basically, if you have a resource, and at an MSP, we sell labor. So our resource is labor. It's people doing support. And even if you're using automation or AI, the labor that automation or AI is offsetting, you're reselling that. So you're just reselling a robot's labor. You're reselling labor. If that employee could have been doing something else, especially framed through the idea of that employee could have been doing something else at the office, or that employee could have been doing something else of higher value on site, that's opportunity cost, because they cannot do those things while they are going on site. On site is going to dedicate and single stream a resource for the entire duration. So the first thing you have to think about with an on site is the total cost of the on site. And it's not just when they get to the client office. There is prep from the office, getting everything ready, printing out paperwork, making sure you have tools, parts, whatever. And that is not something you should throw away lightly, because if you are going on site, as many of you have correctly identified, going on site is a really good opportunity to impress the client. That prep is part of impressing the client, right? So the prep time, the travel time itself, actually being at the client site, if they're there for a while, any breaks they take, they're taking at the client site, which is also an opportunity cost. So any breaks, the time to clean up and wind down at the client, right? Because we always want to leave a client site cleaner and better than when we got there, no matter what we're doing. So there is a wind down cost. The note entry and recap and admin element of being on site, and then the travel back, and then that buffer window it takes somebody to switch from single stream to their next task. So when you pack all that together, it means that an hour on site is actually probably closer for an average client, probably closer to like 3 hours of total time invested. That's only if the actual, on client site is for an hour. And as you start to look at it that way, you realize that like, wow, I'm taking a resource and I am kneecapping them from being productive in any other area of the business for that period of time. If you are somebody right now that's saying, I bill for 100% of that, that's awesome. First of all, good for you. I like that. I like that you're accounting for that. But put a pin in that for a minute. And I want to still try and convince you why that is better than not, but why it still not might be worth doing that. So first and foremost, we have that opportunity cost. Secondly, we have to look at a secondary opportunity cost, especially if you're a smaller MSP where your on-site techs are not dedicated to only being on the road. In other words, they are typically an in-office resource unless they need to go on the road. Even if you've overstaffed your capacity at your MSP and you say to me, well, Dean, I genuinely like having those extra 8 hours in the office from that employee, but I genuinely don't need them on a day-to-day basis if they're on the road. That's great. I hear you. You are still hitting your availability metric. In other words, if a whole flood of calls came in or an incident happened or your most important two clients both needed a priority one ticket done while that person's out, you've removed yourself not only of an additional availability human to add more ability to contribute to that. It now means that all the employees that are there have to now be engaged in those other tasks, which means you've now reduced their opportunity cost. It doesn't hit the other employees the same way. It's not so one employee being out is a 100% opportunity cost on that one employee. That one employee being out of a small team does not 100% hit the rest of the employees, but each one of them gets hit with let's say, a 10 to 20% opportunity cost because that extra resource has been removed. So over time, especially if you're doing this frequently, that can actually dramatically impact your ability to be able to be agile in your response time to things as they come up. And at that smaller MSP, when I say smaller, like less than 30 employees, that can dramatically affect your ability to have all your hands at a busy time delivering that level of excellence that you could have done had you had one or two more people in the building answering calls. That's not as much of a problem if that resource is a fully dedicated on-site resource and never does anything in office. One final really quick note about opportunity cost. If you are still at a size MSP where as the owner, you do a lot of what I'm describing, you are sort of the lead tech, the fire putter outer, it's easy to brush off the idea of opportunity cost because literally that's your entire life. Everything you do as the many hats owner is opportunity cost juggling. And you have 100% accountability and authority as the owner to justify where you're spending your time at any minute. And you're also not locked into 8 hours. You can choose to spend 10 hours, 20 hours, 80-hour a week, whatever you want. So at a very small MSP, I can understand why that argument is less significant. All I'm saying is besides burning the candle at both ends and running yourself ragged, you actually still have this problem. You're just offsetting it by saying, I am the entirety of the labor cogs and I'm willing to spend as much of that as I want at any time. That isn't transitive to employees. So just remember that if right now, it's just you and one or two other techs and you don't really care about that because you can make up for it on a Friday night or over the weekend, as you get a little bit bigger, and this happens super quickly, as you get a little bit bigger, that won't work anymore. And your techs damn sure don't want to work that way. So just put that in the back of your head. So the next really biggest problem and biggest myth, I think, about onsites, there's this idea that onsites, because they check off two things, really. It allows the client to visually see your employee and get a level of interaction and experience they objectively can't get remotely. And because the client can see you doing the work, there is absolutely value in that because it's something tangible, and so much of what we do is intangible. And both of those are absolutely true statements. And as an MSP, if there are tangible things you can do for clients where they can see, I always advise that because it rewards clients for spending money with you by being able to see where that is going. There's a catch though with onsites. The work itself has to be of substantial lingering value for it to actually have that effect in any sort of long-term way. So if I'm installing a new computer for you and you're the CEO of my, the client, and my tech comes on site and does a really great job getting rid of the old one, cleaning everything up, installing the new one, cable managing, that is going to have a decent tail on it for the value, at least a few months, because I look at the computer you set up every day. Every time I use it, I have a chance where I'm going to be like, hey, my great IT company set this up, managed my cables, dusted, made my office better. I like that. But for a lot of other on-site tasks that aren't things like that, the value is very, very short-lived, especially reactive things where you're just fixing a problem. So keep that in the back of your mind, that idea of they're seeing us do the work, it adds value. It really doesn't, unless it's something that as installed is going to be viewed and interacted with daily. And that value has an exponential die-off too. It's not a long-term thing. It's a couple of months at most before it just once again blends in with the scenery. Because otherwise, remember what we said earlier, if I'm just there doing the work and I do that a bunch, I start to blend in with the scenery. It's not that I'm not appreciated, but well, I'm really no different at that point than any other service or admin worker that's going about my duties. The company likes that I'm fixing things. Like, they're not mad. It's just they're not really going to think about it for days afterwards about what a great MSP I was. That's our job. We're the help. The other side of this is this idea that the interaction with the employee on site is really going to have a lot of value to the client, where they can build a relationship, build a lot of trust, get to know your team better, and really remember that it's actual people at your MSP that are supporting them, and therefore shouldn't I go on site? And once again, that is correct. It's often not the reality. The level of employee that you need who's going to be able to go on site and really deliver that kind of experience is actually pretty challenging, because you need an employee that's not only competent at their job, but you need an employee that is very, very friendly, that's able to control any sort of tech resting bitch face, that looks incredibly presentable and represents your brand at all times, that is competent, at least competent enough to appear like they had a reason to be on site, and can talk at a modest level about the business, the relationship with the MSP, and the agreement. That's not a typical employee. And you may have one or two of those employees. So I'm not saying it's impossible that you have someone like that, but are they best used on site all the time, or are they best used back in the office where they can do that for all your clients? And so you start to see a little bit of the risk there, especially if you're with the owner formerly doing the onsite. You can probably do all of that. So it's easy to forget that the next person you send on site probably can't. If you have a really, really, really well dialed in process, and I don't just mean a process for how you support things, a process for how employee, a uniform standard, a way they greet, a way they open the door, a way they unbox things, a way they get rid of trash, a way that maybe they wear booties or no scratch belts, a way they talk to people, a way they move around the office. Like, if all of that is really, really, really well trained and scripted, you can offset quite a bit of requiring a superhero level employee to go on site. I have met maybe a dozen MSPs in the last 15 years that have that level of process, where a lower skilled employee can sort of emulate that, and it still will fall apart if that employee is asked the wrong types of questions and your company doesn't immediately have the remote support services to make up for it. So if you're not an MSP that has account managers that are literally ready on demand for an employee to hit the phone, have them right on with the client, and have that level of training baked into how you go on site, I would not hand wave away saying, well, onsite adds a lot of interactive value to the client. It probably doesn't. And in some cases, it can actually be pretty harmful, because if we're just sending a regular tech on site who just wants to solve a problem, there's a good chance that that tech is not thinking of all the things I just listed. They're just thinking about fixing the problem. That can actually over time start to damage the relationship, because it starts to really equate your on-site employees with the Maytag man, like a blue collar worker. And I'm not criticizing or speaking poorly of a blue collar worker, but your MSP probably presents itself as being a professional service on par with, lawyer, CPA, doctor. It's a very mixed message if then my only in-person interaction is with the person who wears, the blue jumpsuit with a patch name tag on it, that comes in to do the same stuff that my electrician, my plumber, my HVAC guys, and the cleaning crew are doing. And it's a very, 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 very razor's edge, narrow line to walk. And you'll find more often than not, you start to step on the wrong side of it. And so any value you're getting from that actually probably be lost. And it can actually, especially if you're sending otherwise good remote employees, the client can start to frame them around being just the help, and they can actually lose some of their remote credibility in the eyes of the client. So the other thing we really haven't talked about is the financial cost. All the things we just spoke about, if you think about it, if you really want to do this, you have a high opportunity cost. You need somebody who can do either a decent job representing your brand on their own, or a level of inbuilt process and training that will make up for that with a lower level person. And you kind of have those subtle costs of lowering some relationship value areas over time as perceived by the client. Well, all of that stuff has a monetary cost as well. If all you're doing is charging an hourly rate, you're probably not making up for that over the course of the agreement. And that's where I feel that, even if you don't really care with everything else I just said, financially, you're going to find that going on site frequently probably isn't very viable. Let's talk a little bit about why. Before I talk about why it's not, let's talk about a few areas where going on site financially actually probably is, if not viable, close enough to break even that we don't care. Obviously, any scoped work, whether it's a big project or a mini project, you have already gone in and done some sort of calculation where you have said maybe a new computer is going to take X amount of hours to install. Here is a flat fee, and we'll come on site and do it. You've already calculated that. Whether that calculation is good or bad is not what this video is about, but so that's off the table. Same thing with big projects. What I really want to talk about is when you're going on site for either reactive, proactive reasons. In other words, a proactive need has come up reactively that requires you to go on site, but that's for you, not for the client. Or alternatively, for reactive reasons, like we've been talking about. Let's talk about those first, and then we're going to talk about the recurring on site. So in those first two cases, the first thing you have to look at is, are you capturing the totality of the labor costs we talked about earlier in your on-site fee? And the fact of the matter is, I know you're not, because it feels unfair. It feels unfair to bill a client directly for prep time, packing the van or the car, driving there, doing the work, charging for any time that the employee is on site doing other things in service of the company that aren't the work, wrap up time, and travel back. Almost none of us do. Even if you're a break fix company, you probably are not doing full stack portal to portal billing where you're actually charging full rates for everything with a minimum fee to be on site that's at a higher multiplier. If you're doing all of that, so if you have a minimum on-site time, let's say of an hour minimum bill time, you are billing for 100% of all the things I just listed, and you're not discounting any of the rates, well, other than the opportunity cost and lost revenue over there, I guess at least you're billing for all of it. But then you have to figure out, well, where am I billing it to? If I'm billing all of that to a T&M client, at that point, if you're covering all that, you're billing all of that, and your client's happy paying for it, good job. I'm proud of you. The company who made this really cool piece of software, Fitware, they built a massive MSP 501 listed MSP kind of on that model. And I know some other fairly large MSPs that have that model. If you can make that all work, good for you. You don't need to watch the rest of the video. It's not a lot of us. So if you're taking that time and you're billing it against a retainer, a all-you-can-eat agreement, or you're billing for some of it T&M, well, now we start getting into this dangerous land where your agreement probably wasn't priced to absorb what, is the totality of the actual dollar value of that engagement. So you probably are tanking the profitability of your agreement right away. If you're doing a block or a retainer, you're eating up a lot more of the block than the client perceives. So the client's very likely to get aggravated because they can't see you prepping and traveling there. They can only see you when they're there. So the only part of the bill they want to pay is the part where you're there. And if you're just billing pure T&M, same thing applies. Your client can only see part of that, and they're not really going to want to pay for all of that. And even if they're actually willing to pay for all of that, or you think they won't. And so you're probably really hesitant to charge for all of that. So odds are you're either not capturing that revenue, or if you are, it is hurting your profitability on that agreement. So let's go over for a minute and talk about the financials of a recurring onsite, because we haven't really talked about recurring onsites yet. So what I'm going to do, just to reduce the size of this video, I'm going to make a second video where we specifically talk about everything we talked about in this video around the idea of the recurring onsite, because that's where things can kind of get a little bit interesting, and where the MSP that is either a little bit more operationally mature or a little bit more revenue savvy may try to implement a recurring onsite as part of their service offering. Once again, regardless of their revenue model, you can do some interesting things there, but once again, it's not a magic wand, and you still got to be careful. So we'll talk about that in the next video. Thank you for sticking with me for this one. I really do like talking about onsites.